We are back with part 2 of the Mafia in Maine, except we are not visiting Maine today.
No, we are heading to the massage parlors in Boston and other various states instead. But before we get into that tale, we need to tell Joe Puzzangara's story.
And we need to answer the mailbag question of the week.
More like questions.
Oh, yes, from one of our OG listeners, David.
We love you, David. You're great.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And David sends us both down rabbit holes, but more you than me.
Well, that is true. So let's dive right in.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question was, how long was little Joe Napolitano an informant for Zip Connolly? So, David, you sent me down a rabbit hole, and I started looking at the 302s on Mary Farrell, and I am still of the opinion that little Joe Napolitano was not an informant and that Zip Connolly lied.
I tend to agree with you. I believe there were several informants that weren't actually informants, but were labeled as such to facilitate the intel laundering project or to get even with them for a laundry list of other reasons.
Well, that is true, and it does appear that they had an informant in Buffalo who was more reporting on little Joe than anything else.
And who was kind of giving half-assed information, too.
Like well, he was from Buffalo. He didn't know Boston.
I know, and he was trying to give the combat zone the teddy bear lounge, and he gave the wrong guy, and whatever. I won't take you down that rabbit hole, I promise.
Okay, but I will be sure to post those, maybe in the show notes, those specific documents that I found on Mary Farrell.
Yeah, that works. So we can just get it up on the website, because I have to get back to maintaining the website properly, my upcoming weekend project.
Okay, so David's second question was, did little Joe Napolitano know Sonny Mercurio?
So we are going to be answering that question towards the end of the episode.
For sure. Okay. And as far as any informant connection, so Sonny Mercurio was an informant starting in early 1963 after he got out of prison for the murder that he committed.
Oh, yeah.
The numbers were issued sequentially by the FBI. So your dad's number was BS 839, issued on May 14th, 1962. The wiretap at Jay's Lounge was BS 856 on January 9th, 1963. And Sonny's number was BS 861. So he was officially an informant starting from early 1963, like I said, much longer than little Joe, who, again, if he were an informant, probably didn't really make a deal until the first counterfeiting arrest in 75.
Okay. And we will get more into the second wiretap at Jerry's later in the season, so we should revisit the first wiretap at Jerry's.
Yeah, well, since it was also illegally installed, in my opinion, we will definitely come back to it.
Mm-hmm.
And for David's last question, who do you think killed little Joe? Well, we never found anything concrete, and the rumor mill was quiet, so not so much speculation. But my early hypothesis was that Larry Bayoni killed them. But your original theory that the Napolitanos were answering to the Colombos before Patriarca and the fact that they were killed in New York makes me lean towards someone in the Colombo family being the killer. And the Napolitanos were also linked to members of the Buffalo and Miami Mafia, like I said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That really made for some interesting reading. So definitely check out the show notes, you guys.
And there's also the possibility that the Napolitanos themselves could have been responsible for the hit.
Well, it is not unheard of. We know that Michael Francese's dad called a hit on him when he found out that his son flipped in the 80s. So I definitely would not rule out that as a hypothesis.
True, and also bring up some other hints as we get further into this episode. Okay, so with the questions out of the way, can we continue into the 1970s, please?
You are being so optimistic. We have to go back to the 60s for a few minutes.
I give up. I surrender. Tell us what Puzzangara was up to in the 60s and why we are talking about Puzzangara after Napolitano.
Okay, well, he should have been in the first episode.
Okay, but we were trying to stay around 30 minutes.
Exactly. So in an effort to save time, I will skip Joe's genealogy, but for those interested, you can find it on WikiTree. And hopefully you can link to it in the show notes for people who are interested. And eventually we'll get to the connection between little Joe Napolitano and Joe Puzzangara.
Gotcha, and I will do my best to get the links in, I promise. Now, tell us about Joe.
Okay, well, one of the main sources of information about Joe Puzzangara's early days of crime was none other than the famous fiction writer, your favorite, Vinnie Teresa.
And as Dad would say when I was caught fibbing, you've got more tales than Mark Twain. Well, Vinny, in my opinion, was certainly more of a tale teller than any of the other informants, but I'd say that applies actually to 80% of the information that these guys were feeding to the feds.
They were really great fiction writers. These were some
Yeah, they
great
were.
reading, though.
Yes.
And not to get too off track, but did you know that there were over 11,000 informants in New York City by the early 70s?
And I thought Boston was bad with 1,100. I say this all the time, but there were more informants than there were wise guys.
It's true. Anyhow, Vinny claimed that in the early 60s, Putzangara and Al Fifi were robbing women's clothing stores at his behest, and they were disposing of the stuff through Henry Tamilio.
And all I can say is poor Henry.
Well, Putzangara was also an old associate of Joe Francione's. In May of 64, the duo were arrested for robbing the old Newbury Golf Course in Newburyport. Less than a year later, Francione would be killed by Jimmy Fleming.
And Anthony Sacramone, who was also an associate of Puzzangara, was killed just a few months earlier in October.
Exactly, and we covered all of those in the hit parade of 64, I think.
Yes.
So, a month after Francione got killed, according to the authorities, Puzzangara pled guilty to breaking into a fur store on Newbury Street in order to avoid getting killed by Jimmy Fleming.
I just don't get what security prison was going to offer, especially back in those days. And by the way, was it Caicus Firs that got robbed?
I don't know what that is, but probably. But
That's...
this is the same spot that Tommy Donati was pinched for robbing, so I know that much.
Okay, so it was Caicus Firs, and I'm going to offend I don't know who at this point, but I miss wearing fur.
You live in the desert.
That's not true. I live 2 hours from the desert.
Yeah, well, I still remember when you took me to the desert to die.
Will you survive to tell these tales?
Barely, and then they almost didn't let me leave. I thought I really was going to die then.
I forgot about that. Okay, back to Puzzangara. Judge Toro was happy to accommodate his wishes and sentenced him to 4 to 10 years in prison.
I like Judge Charo.
He was very busy, though.
Anyway, but he wasn't the only one. Another of Sacramone's associates pled out to narcotics charges, plus Harry Johnson, who is facing extortion charges involving Russell Nicholson, the MDC cop, who had been killed the year before. And you can hear more about all of that in episodes 13 and 25 in season 1.
Okay, let's move on to June of 1972. Puzzangara was arrested with Richie Costucci and St. Laurent in the parking lot of a restaurant in Walpole, Mass. During a gaming raid. They were charged with possessing gaming apparatus and using the public phone for gaming purposes. They were each released on $2,500 bail.
Well, the timing of the arrest was really interesting. Just a few days earlier, Costucci had pleaded the Fifth at a hearing of the House Select Committee on Crime. He told them, quote, "I never done nothing wrong. I can't testify today anyway. My lawyer's on a murder trial," unquote. And the committee was investigating race fixing, which eventually led to the indictment and arrest of Howie Winter and co. a few years later.
Someday we're going to get to that episode.
Yeah, eventually we will send Howie to Leavenworth.
You'll see, we'll get there. Anyhow, nothing ever came of the gaming charges, correct?
Well, I suspect the cops were just giving Costucci a hard time for not cooperating a few days earlier. But
Probably.
anyway, let's move on to late July of 75 when Puzzangara's house caught fire at 3:30 in the morning while the family were away vacationing on the Cape. The fire reportedly started in the back bedroom and spread to the attic. It took about an hour and a half to bring it under control after the neighbors called the fire department. The authorities said that there was $7,000 worth of damages. But wasn't it rumored that Puzzangara was good with explosives?
That's what they say, but I'm not sure. And 5 days later, another fire broke out at the still unoccupied house. The fire chief in Revere called it definitely arson and noted that they had discovered residue of melted plastic containers with traces of flammable fluids in the house. 2 of the firefighters were severely injured with second-degree burns. Now, whether the containers were evidence of arson or bomb-making supplies was never clarified.
Well, he's just lucky he didn't get a murder charge added to the other stuff,
Very
quite
lucky.
frankly.
Very.
Anyway, I think we should mention for our listeners who aren't familiar with this time period that in the 60s and 70s, bombs, dynamite, and explosions were not as rare of an occurrence in the Boston area as they should have been.
Yes, usually it was an effort to kill a rival or an enemy, but it wasn't exclusive to the Boston area only and wasn't exclusive just to the wise guys.
There was also a lot of arson and insurance fraud going on at the
Well,
time, so maybe we can
that's
come
true.
back to that too. But the
That's true.
radicals were the ones using the explosives and more likely to take out a civilian in the process. But back to Putzangara, he wasn't just wrapped up in theft and gambling. In 79, he was arrested along with five others for using counterfeit U.S. Treasury notes to secure over $1 million in loans from the Framingham Trust Company, along with other banks from 1974 to 1977. And that brings us to his connection to little Joe Napolitano.
It is about freaking time.
Oh, please. People like our long winded backstories.
I like our long-winded backstories too, but even I was waiting for the answer to this one.
Okay, so on September 8th, 77, Putzangara was arrested along with Mickey Napolitano, Little Joe's cousin, John Giannani, and the Shapiros for the counterfeiting. And that's the case we covered last week where Little Joe was exposed as an informant. Although, again, I just have a hard time believing it.
I know, I'm with you. And was Puzengar convicted?
Well, he was scheduled to be sentenced on September 12th for being convicted of possessing some $300,000 worth of treasury notes in another case, but was still out on bail when Burns' office scooped him up. He ended up pleading guilty in the second case in April of 78, along with Mickey Napolitano and the Shapiros. I couldn't find the exact sentence, but he was definitely free by early 84, and he passed away on July 3rd, 1995.
Okay, let's get back to 1978 and the massage parlors where we left off last week.
Okay, but here's the connection. On November 15th, 1978, Sonny Mercurio, Richie Floramo, Mickey Napolitano, and Samuel Knorr pled guilty to avoid long prison sentences. Two of the other defendants were by then the deceased John Giannani and little Joe Napolitano, who had been found stuffed in trash bags in the trunk of a rental car in Queens just 2 months earlier. Giannani had been shot and little Joe had been garroted and shot. Their bodies were tied together, and that answers one of David's questions. Did Sonny and Napolitano know each other?
And that they did. And we should look, so this is where my thing about hints to possibly who killed Napolitano and Giannani. So we should look at hits in New York where victims were garroted and shot in garbage bags and tied together, and then see if we can find out at least maybe who ordered those, like the families that ordered those hits, and then maybe it narrows it down because it can't be that many people.
I mean, the garroted thing reminds me of Larry Bayoni, which is how I got there in the first place. But since the Napolitanos had a wider connection, broader connection than
Mm-hmm.
just Boston, it does make sense. And the only hitter I know, honestly, is Scarpa. So, but I don't think it was him.
No, I don't think so either. So maybe when we get some spare time, we'll do some digging. Anything is possible. Okay, back to the massage parlor case. There were two other defendants who chose to go on trial, Michael Porcaro and Charles Tastian. And weren't we going to do an episode on Tastian?
Well, we were, and this was kind of supposed to be it, but we got so involved with the Napolitanos. But anyway, we'll do Tashin when we do some of the wiretaps. I think maybe that'll be a better place for him.
Okay, I mean, listen, the Napolitano thing came because our listener Louie sent us that great, question about it. So that's how we ended up.
And it was really good. I think
Yes.
we did a good job with it.
I think so too. Okay, sorry.
Okay, but in the massage parlor, and in particular Mercurio and Floramo, last week we mentioned that the two of them had been arrested in Pennsylvania for possession of stolen securities, totaling $23 million, for which they were both serving 15-year federal sentences. And it wouldn't be until January of 79 that they were sentenced to 5 years for the massage parlor cases to be run concurrent with the security sentence. Sonny would remain in prison until 86.
It's interesting to me that even with his informant status, he wound up sitting in the pen for 8 years.
Maybe they dropped him, though.
Probably. I mean, and it's not a blanket thing where, oh, you're an informant, you're not going to go away. Percent of the time, that's the case. But we don't have the full file, so I don't know. He probably did get dropped.
So I was kind of assuming that he, led the charge there, but maybe that's not true.
No. Well, we're going to have to, when we get into doing the Sonny episode towards the end of this season, we're going to have to go digging much more into that.
Okay. As for Floramo, the authorities claim that he had a hit kit containing a 357 Magnum and a 38 Special, surgical gloves, and hollow point ammo on him when they arrested him in Mercurio in Pittsburgh. But they never prosecuted him for any murders, and I've never heard of anything like that he hit somebody, so I don't
No.
know what that was all about. Um, but like Sonny, he was also an attendee of the 1989 making ceremony, so we'll revisit him later when we do that episode, I think.
Which implies, though, that he did kill someone along the way because was he actually getting inducted in that? I don't want to get off track, but yes.
Oh,
So anyhow,
I think,
so
yes, I think that's
yes,
true.
yeah. So anyhow, he killed somebody, not necessarily with his quote unquote hit kit. As for the massage parlors, there were three still operating after the trial under the Swedish sauna moniker. In February of 1979, the authorities raided the one on Route 1 in Peabody. It was the first RICO case in the state of Massachusetts.
The first of many.
And on that note, let's wrap it up today.
Okay, next week we'll be back with the making ceremony of 1977.
Oh, it's probably going to be a long one, I suspect. Thanks everyone for listening. Bye bye.
Bye.